that I was here with you.
That's right.
Because I was going to celebrate my 90th. So I'm going to be
For decades, Carol Burnett was America's safest star. She made millions laugh. She won awards. She built a career that looked spotless from the outside. But behind the bright lights and Saturday night applause, there was another story unfolding, one far more complicated than anyone realized. Join us as we uncover the truth behind Carol Burnett's double life. Apartment 102. To understand Carol Burnett's strength later in life, it helps to start with where she grew up. Apartment 102 in a low-rent part of Hollywood in the 1940s. When people hear Hollywood, they often think of movie stars, big homes, and bright lights. But Carol's Hollywood was not like that. She lived close to the famous places, but her daily life looked nothing like the glamorous world people saw on screen. The apartment was small and cramped. It wasn't a home with extra rooms or space to spread out. It was a single room that Carol shared with her grandmother, the woman she lovingly called Nanny. Almost everything they owned had to fit into that one space. A Murphy bed took up most of the room. It folded up into the wall, which helped them use the space during the day, but it also showed how limited their living situation was. There was no separate bedroom where Carol could go for privacy and no living room where the family could relax. It was one room for sleeping, eating, and getting through the day. Even small comforts were hard to find. Money was tight, and electricity could feel like a luxury. At night, they sometimes left the closet door open, so the light from the hallway could shine into the room. It was a simple trick, but it mattered. That faint hallway glow made the space feel a little less lonely and a little less scary. It also shows just how much they had to stretch what little they had. Carol learned early that you don't always get what you need, and sometimes you find a way to make do anyway. What made it even harder was the contrast around them. Just a few miles away, Hollywood was selling a dream. Movie stars were being photographed, films were being made, and people were chasing fame. Carol was surrounded by the idea of success, but she was living in deep poverty. She could see the fantasy world nearby, but she couldn't reach it. That gap between what the public saw and what she lived would become a theme in her life. The deepest pain in Carol's childhood wasn't only about money. It was what was happening with her parents. Both her mother and father were described as talented, attractive people with big dreams. But they were trapped by alcoholism. Addiction was not just a background problem. It shaped everything. It changed the mood of the room. It changed what Carol could count on. It changed who her parents were from one day to the next. When a parent struggles with addiction, a child often lives with emotional unpredictability. One moment might feel calm, and the next might feel tense, angry, or confusing. Carol learned that love could be present but unstable. Her parents could be warm and kind at times, and then suddenly distant, messy, or frightening. Over time, that kind of environment teaches a child to watch carefully, to read small signs, and to prepare for problems before they explode. Because of this, Carol became the adult in the room at a young age. She didn't have the freedom to just be a child. She became a peacemaker. She tried to keep things from falling apart. She learned to manage other people's feelings because no one else was doing it. That is a heavy role for a child, and it leaves marks that don't disappear just because life improves later. This is where humor entered her life in a serious way. For Carol, jokes weren't only about being funny. They were a tool. When tension built up, she could use humor to shift the mood. When things felt unstable, a laugh could buy a few minutes of calm. Comedy wasn't her hobby. It was a way to survive the day. Those early instincts, timing, facial expressions, and quick lines didn't come from comfort. They came from chaos. And the emotional split started early too. On the outside, she could make people laugh. On the inside, she carried fear, sadness, and worry about what addiction might do next. That split between what people saw and what she felt began in apartment 102. And once you understand that, you can see why the next chapter of her life wasn't just about fame. It was also about secrets, survival, and the promises she kept. Rehook. Next, wait until you hear about the mysterious envelope that changed everything and the secret she kept for decades. The $1,000 Promise. Carol Burnett's life could have gone in a very different direction if one thing had not happened at the exact moment she needed it most. Before the bright stage lights and the standing ovations, she was simply a young woman trying to find a way out of a hard childhood. She had talent, she had drive, and she had a dream that felt bigger than her world. But she also had one problem that talent alone could not fix: money. When Carol was accepted to UCLA, it should have been a proud, exciting moment. Getting into a university meant possibility. It meant a path forward, a chance to study, and a chance to build a future that wasn't shaped by chaos at home. But for Carol, acceptance didn't automatically mean she could attend. Tuition, living costs, and basic expenses were more than her family could handle. Poverty wasn't just a background detail in her life, it was a wall in front of her plans. This is the part many people don't understand about poverty. It doesn't only limit what you can buy, it limits what you can imagine doing next. Carol had already learned how to make do, how to stretch every dollar, and how to stay strong in difficult situations. But university required more than grit. It required money up front. And that reality hit her hard. The dream she had worked toward suddenly looked like it might collapse before it even started. Then came the moment that changed everything: the mysterious benefactor. Carol performed at a private party, doing what she could to get noticed and to keep moving forward. At some point during that event, a businessman approached her. He wasn't someone she knew. He didn't come with a public name or attention. He simply saw something in her that made him believe she deserved a real chance. And instead of offering advice or empty encouragement, he offered something concrete. He gave her an envelope containing $1,000. Today, that number might not sound life-changing to everyone, but at that time it was a huge amount of money, especially for someone who had grown up counting every penny. This was the kind of money that could open doors. It could pay for travel. It could support training. It could give her a real shot at a career she could not afford to chase on her own. But the gift came with conditions, and those conditions mattered just as much as the money. First, he made her promise she would never reveal his identity. Not to friends, not to the press, not to anyone. He wanted to remain completely unknown. Second, he told her to use the money boldly. In other words, she was not supposed to waste time or play it safe. She was to take a real step toward her dream. Third, he told her that if she ever became successful, she needed to help others the way he helped her. Not with words, but with action. Carol accepted the money, and she accepted the promises. That decision says a lot about her. She didn't treat the gift like a casual favor. She treated it like a responsibility. She understood that this was rare, and she didn't want to dishonor it. Soon after, she boarded a train to New York City. That trip wasn't just a move on a map. It was her stepping away from addiction, poverty, and the painful memories of home. But leaving a place doesn't erase what happened there. Carol carried emotional scars with her. She had learned fear, uncertainty, and the habit of staying strong no matter what. Those things didn't disappear just because she was heading to a new city. And she carried something else too, a secret. The identity of that businessman became the first major secret she kept for decades. She did not use it for publicity. She did not trade it for attention. She honored the promise, even when she became famous, and people would have loved to know the story. That $1,000 didn't just buy her a train ticket. It marked the start of a life built on courage, discipline, and keeping her word. Rehook. Next up, New York is where she starts turning raw talent into real fame and where her public life begins to take shape fast. Broadway breakthrough. When Carol Burnett arrived in New York, she wasn't walking into an easy life. She was walking into a city where thousands of talented people were fighting for the same small number of chances. But Carol had something that stood out right away. She wasn't trying to be the perfect Hollywood type. She wasn't trying to look delicate or mysterious. She was building a different kind of presence, one that was loud, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Her big turning point came with Once Upon a Mattress, the Broadway musical that helped introduce her to a much bigger audience. This role didn't just show that she could sing or act. It showed that she could command a stage. Carol's physical comedy style became one of her biggest strengths here. She could use her whole body to get a laugh, not just her words. She could move in a way that felt bold and fearless. She wasn't afraid to look silly, and that courage made the comedy hit harder. She also wasn't traditionally glamorous, and she didn't pretend to be. Carol was tall and lanky, with features that didn't fit the usual leading lady mold of the time, but instead of trying to hide that, she leaned into it. She made it part of her style. That choice gave her a real advantage because it made her memorable. You didn't confuse her with anyone else. She became the kind of performer people talked about after the show because her energy felt different. One of the most powerful tools she had was her face. Carol's facial expressions were elastic in the best way. She could stretch her eyes wide, shift her mouth, and change her whole look in a second. On stage, that matters because the audience isn't right next to you. You need big expressions that can travel across the room. Carol could do that naturally. She could turn a simple line into something funnier, just by reacting in a way that felt honest and exaggerated at the same time. All of this created her distinct stage presence. She didn't just perform the role, she filled the space. She could be sweet one moment and wildly funny the next. She could be loud without losing control. She could be messy in a way that still felt smart. That mix made her feel bold, and Broadway noticed. This success also changed what was possible for her. Up to that point, a lot of Carol's life had been about survival, getting through poverty, managing family pain, and finding a way forward. Broadway was different. Broadway was proof. It was a public sign that she belonged in entertainment, not as a lucky break, but as a real professional who could deliver night after night. With Broadway came television opportunities. People in the industry started to see that Carol didn't just have talent. She had range. She could sing, act, and deliver comedy with timing that couldn't be taught easily. And most importantly, she connected with audiences. That connection is what TV networks look for, because it means people will keep watching. As the doors opened, Carol began crafting a public persona. She came across as wholesome, warm, and unstoppable. She wasn't selling scandal. She wasn't trying to shock people. She felt approachable, like someone you could trust. That image didn't appear by accident. It matched her instincts and her values, and it helped her stand out in a world where fame often comes with noise and drama. Broadway didn't erase her past, but it gave her a new identity, someone who could turn pain into performance and still keep her dignity intact. Next, she takes that Broadway confidence straight into television, and that's where she starts fighting for something no one expected a woman to win. The CBS gamble. By the time Carol Burnett was gaining real attention, she had already proved she could handle big stages and big audiences. But television was a different kind of fight. In the 1960s, the variety show world was still treated like a men's club. The biggest names in that space were men, and the format was seen as something men naturally led. Women were often expected to fit into a smaller box, play the wife, play the girlfriend, support the male star, and stay pleasant. Carol didn't want that box. When she began pitching the idea of a female-led variety show, she was asking for something that networks rarely handed to women. A variety show wasn't just a job. It was power. It meant a weekly platform, creative control, a team of writers and performers, and the chance to shape what America watched at home. CBS executives were skeptical. Some of them reportedly pushed back with the idea that variety was a man's game. They suggested she would be better off in a sitcom role, where she could be the funny woman next to a male lead and not carry the whole production. But Carol had a clear vision of what she wanted: sketch comedy, music, strong characters, and a show that could be smart without being mean. She also knew she could do it. The gamble wasn't only about ratings. It was about whether a woman could lead this kind of show and win in prime time. In 1967, that gamble became real when the Carol Burnett show launched. From the start, it felt different. Carol wasn't trying to copy anyone. She built the show around her strengths: bold physical comedy, quick character changes, and a style that made people feel included instead of talked down to. The show ran for 11 seasons, which is a major achievement for any series, especially in a format that depends on weekly freshness. Over time, it won 25 Emmy Awards, showing that it wasn't just popular. It was respected at the highest level. Rehook. Next, a tabloid story tries to destroy her image in one shot, and it hits her right where it hurts most. The tabloid attack. By 1976, Carol Burnett was one of the most trusted faces on television. For nearly a decade, she had walked into American living rooms every Saturday night with warmth and confidence. She was known for clean comedy, kindness, and professionalism. That reputation wasn't just good for her career, it meant something personal to her. And that's why what happened next hurt so deeply. In 1976, National Enquirer published a story claiming that Carol had been seen drunk in a Washington, D.C. restaurant, loudly arguing with Henry Kissinger. The story painted her as rowdy, out of control, and intoxicated in public. For some celebrities, a rumor like that might have been dismissed as typical tabloid gossip. But for Carol, this accusation was not small. It struck at the center of her identity. The story was fabricated. It wasn't based on truth, but the damage wasn't only about whether people believed it. The emotional impact came from what the accusation represented. Alcohol had destroyed her childhood. She had watched both of her parents struggle with alcoholism. She had seen how addiction changed personalities, broke trust, and created chaos. As a result, Carol made a clear decision early in life. She would not let alcohol control her. She avoided drinking because she was deeply afraid of repeating the pattern she had witnessed. So, when the tabloid accused her of being drunk and disorderly, it wasn't just suggesting she had a bad night. It was tying her name to the very thing that had hurt her family. It reopened wounds she had worked hard to manage privately. Publicly, she was known as wholesome and steady. Privately, she carried fear about addiction and the pain it had caused. That split, the public image and the private trauma, collided in that moment. Many people around her advised her to ignore the story. Tabloids thrived on attention. Lawsuits were expensive and emotionally draining. Some warned her that fighting the press could backfire. Others said it would only keep the story alive longer. But Carol refused to stay silent. She chose to sue the National Enquirer for libel. It wasn't about money, it was about principle. She wanted to prove that the story was false and that reputations mattered. Going to court meant putting herself in a public legal battle, facing headlines, and reliving the accusation again and again. It wasn't easy, but she stood firm. The case became historic. At the time, few celebrities had successfully taken on tabloids in court. Many believed it was impossible to win against sensational journalism. But Carol did win. The jury ruled in her favor. and it became a landmark victory. The decision sent a message that even powerful media outlets could not publish false claims without consequences. In the courtroom, she showed strength. She was calm, clear, and determined. She defended her name with the same confidence she brought to the stage. Publicly, it looked like another triumph. She had taken on a giant and come out on top. Rehook. What she faced next wasn't a headline. It was something far more painful, and it was happening inside her own family. Carrie Hamilton's spiral. For years, the public saw Carol Burnett as steady and safe. She was the woman who could make a whole country laugh without being cruel. She looked like the kind of person who had everything under control. But behind the curtain, her private life was being pulled back into the same pain she thought she had escaped. The fear that haunted Carol wasn't just about her own childhood anymore. It was about her daughter. Carol had grown up watching alcoholism swallow her parents. She understood addiction in a way that wasn't theoretical. She had lived it as a child who had to stay alert, stay careful, and stay strong. So when her eldest daughter, Carrie Hamilton, began struggling with drug addiction as a teenager, it didn't feel like a new problem. It felt like the same nightmare coming back with a new face. For Carol, this wasn't just heartbreak, it was terror. Addiction in families often comes with a mix of genetic risk and emotional damage passed down over time. Carol already carried a deep fear that something in the family history could repeat itself. When Carrie started to spiral, Carol couldn't separate it from what she had seen before. She wasn't only watching her daughter change, she was watching patterns she recognized too well: secrecy, mood swings, denial, and the slow loss of trust that addiction creates. And there was an emotional layer that made it even harder. Carol had worked so hard to build a different home for her children than the one she grew up in. She had money, stability, and love. Yet addiction was still there. That can make a parent feel helpless in a very specific way. It can feel like everything you did wasn't enough to protect the person you love. In that era, celebrity families rarely spoke openly about addiction. The image of the perfect family was treated like a business asset. If you admitted trouble at home, people might judge you, blame you, or treat you like you were hiding something worse. Many public figures stayed silent and tried to handle everything privately. Carol did something different. She decided that silence helped addiction grow. She chose to speak openly about her family crisis, even though it meant tearing down the very image the public loved. The warm, goofy, unshakable mother figure who had everything under control. She gave interviews. She appeared in magazines. She admitted that Carrie was struggling and that their home life was not as simple as it looked from the outside. This was risky. Some fans might lose their fantasy. Some reporters might twist the story. Some people might say she was exploiting her daughter's pain. But Carol's goal wasn't publicity. It was pressure and honesty. She wanted to remove the hiding place addiction uses. Over time, the hard work began to pay off. Carrie reached sobriety, and that changed everything. Recovery doesn't erase the past, but it can open space for a new relationship. Mother and daughter began to repair the trust that addiction had damaged. They became close again, not just as family, but as creative partners. Together, they worked on Hollywood Arms, a play based on Carol's memoir and their shared experiences. This mattered because it turned private pain into honest art. It wasn't about pretending everything was fine. It was about telling the truth in a way that could help people understand what families go through. For Carol, it was also a way to connect with Carrie on a deeper level. They weren't only surviving side by side anymore. They were building something together. Rehook. And just when it seemed like they had finally won, life hit them with something they couldn't fight the same way: an illness. After everything Carol Burnett and her daughter Carrie Hamilton had already survived, it would have made sense to believe the worst was behind them. They had lived through addiction, recovery, and the slow work of rebuilding trust. They had found their way back to each other, not just as mother and daughter, but as partners. Then came the kind of crisis that doesn't respond to tough love, fame, money, or willpower. In 2001, Carrie was diagnosed with lung cancer. Even before the details became clear, the words alone were terrifying. Carrie was still young, and she had worked hard to reclaim her life. The diagnosis felt unfair and surreal. Then the news got even worse. The cancer had spread to her brain. That meant the illness was not contained. It was aggressive. It was already moving into the place that controls speech, movement, memory, and personality. For Carol, it was shock layered on shock. After years of fighting to keep Carrie alive in one way, she was now facing a threat that couldn't be argued with or outworked. The disbelief was strong because it didn't fit the story they thought they were living. Carrie had gotten sober. She was stable. She was creating again. She had plans. The idea that life could suddenly turn that off felt impossible to accept. And yet, there it was, confirmed by doctors and tests. The fight had changed from choices and behavior to biology and time. Carol became a constant presence during Carrie's illness. She kept vigil at the hospital, sitting by her daughter's bedside, watching the effects of treatment and the disease itself. This kind of suffering is its own world. Days become long. Nights blur together. Small changes can feel huge, good or bad. Carol wasn't just watching her daughter struggle physically. She was watching her strength fade. The same daughter who had fought her way back from addiction was now being drained by something she couldn't push away. And in that hospital room, the roles flipped in the hardest way. Carol had spent her life being strong for others, making people laugh, and keeping a sense of control even when things were painful. But in this situation, she couldn't fix anything. She could only stay close, speak softly, and love Carrie through it. Near the end, Carrie gave Carol something that would stay with her forever, a final whispered promise. She told her mother she would not be gone completely. She said she would send a sign, that she would find a way to let Carol know she was okay. It was a simple statement, but it landed with enormous weight. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't dramatic. It was intimate, personal, and full of meaning for a mother who was about to lose her child. Carrie died in 2002 at the age of 38. For Carol, the world changed in an instant. The laughter that had filled her life on stage and off couldn't touch this. Silence replaced everything. Grief isn't something you perform your way out of. It doesn't respond to timing or talent. It is heavy, and it stays. This was the first time Carol faced an ending she could not rewrite, soften, or turn into something manageable. She had survived poverty, fought tabloids, and battled addiction in her family. But she could not protect Carrie from death. After Carrie was gone, Carol carried that promise of a sign like a fragile object. Some people would call it hope. Others would call it grief, looking for comfort. For Carol, it was simply something her daughter had said, and she couldn't forget it. Not long after Carrie's death, Carol experienced a moment that felt impossible to ignore. She was dining in a restaurant, and grief hit her hard. Then a stranger approached her table and handed her a bouquet of birds of paradise, Carrie's favorite flower. The timing was intense. The detail was specific. The gesture was quiet, not showy. It left Carol shaken and emotional because it felt too exact to be random. But even moments like that come with conflict. Carol had to wrestle privately with what it meant. Was it coincidence? Was it kindness from someone who knew her pain? Or was it the kind of sign Carrie promised? When you're grieving, your mind can search for meaning, but your heart can also recognize comfort. When it arrives, Carol didn't need a public answer. The moment gave her something personal, something that felt like connection instead of total loss. Rehook. And sadly, even after losing Carrie, Carol's fight with addiction in her family wasn't over yet. If you liked this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and join us for more deep dives into the lives behind the spotlight.